Over here, we've got a whole table of parts for the Daihatsu Hijet, including HD springs, some switches, an air compressor pump, which you'll see that later. We got a new starter just in case. We got some tire chains with V grooves welded on them. We've got an adjustable lift kit with adjustable camber and caster. These are shackles for the rear end. We've got some CV boots. We've got some hoses. We've got an air filter. All kinds of good stuff for that little guy. It's going to be riding a lot higher and cleaner shortly. All right, mini truck's going under the knife. We're going to do the lift kit, CV joint, and then new tires. So while Charlie's figuring out how the suspension works, I'm doing the tires. This little bead breaker worked awesome. So you tighten this bolt down, it grabs the rim. You tighten this bolt down and it busted it right off the bead instantly. That's pretty handy dandy. So now I can very easily bust the beads without doing any real work. All right, so the first tire is on the rim. Of course, having the right tools helps. This is extremely helpful for breaking the beads, and this is extremely helpful for putting it back on the tire. It keeps it from rotating and it keeps it down in the V. Pretty easy tire to mount considering these are E-rated tires on 12-inch wheels, so they're a little stiff compared to the factory when I took off. But here's a comparison of the factory 145 next to this 155 with no air. You can see that it's a little taller, a little fatter, a lot deeper tread. Of course, I'll air them up and do a real good comparison and do all the weights and everything else, but I think this is a good little tire, super cheap. Set was like 200 bucks, DOT approved, and they're a lot more durable for off-roading than the stock ones are as far as, you know, tread depth and puncture resistance. I think they're gonna work just fine, and I love the factory wheels, so I'm not changing that. Of course, this thing has 4x110 lug pattern, so it's gonna get ATV tires on it at some point for shits and giggles. All right, so they're both aired up to 40 PSI. And you can see the 255 is a little wider and a little taller. I picked the 255 that said that had the biggest diameter because obviously all the tire sizes are slightly different. This one's about an inch higher, but the tread is a lot more off-roady. Still not super off-roady, but it'll be a big improvement, especially with tire chains. So let's see the weight difference. So the stock tire and wheel on the scale weighs 22 pounds, and then that's a 145. The 155 E-rated tire is 27.4 pounds. So we're adding 5 pounds per corner, which isn't bad. More durability, more traction, pretty good. So it's got to mount all the other ones, but I think that's going to be good. I didn't want to put a crazy oversized tire on it and just ruin the on-road performance, but I definitely wanted some more height, and we achieved that. So we got the driver's side, which is the right side, all tore down to change that CV boot. It popped out of the differential very easily. And Charlie's removing the knuckle now. It's kind of stuck in the bearing. Oh yeah, some water got in there. I don't know when that happened. Hole paw. And then we're gonna change that boot because that boot is tore up. All right, so the reason the axle was stuck in the knuckle was because the nut was still on the other side. Pro tip, take the nut all the way off. And now I'm trying to separate this outer joint and it's being a bear, but it's so packed with mud and sand, I think the C-clip can't compress in to let it snap off. So I'm gonna go get some gas so I could soak this in gas and get it loosened up, but it got totally packed with sand at Holopal. I do think I can save this axle though. Some fresh grease, some new boots, should be good to go. All right, so I rebuilt the CV axle. It was a pain in the ass like every other CV axle. This one was fine, so I left it alone. Just rebuilt the outer. This boot, I can put a link in the description for where I got it. It's a little too big. You have to make sure you get this band super tight in order to get enough clamping force. But this axle was full of sand, but now that it's all cleaned out with fresh grease, hopefully we'll get some good life out of it. It does have some rust and some pitting along the shaft, but it's fine. Open differential, little tiny tires, you know, it'll be okay. So now I'm gonna throw it back together. We got the lift kit on there on one side. So we got the heavy duty spring. I left off the plastic rubber guard thing because this spring's diameter is a little smaller than the OEM spring and it wasn't fitting right. But this spring is a higher spring rate and it's a little bit longer, so that'll give us some more preload. And then we got the spacer on top. It does have the adjustment so we can slide it this way in order to get the camber decent. You can see that in there. See the slots? So that's pretty cool. And yeah, just gotta throw the axle in there and throw it back together, and then finish the lift on the other side, and then do the shackles on the rear, and then mount the other 3 tires, and then we're good to go. All right, so we're assembling the strut on the passenger side. That's the new spring. As you can see, it's a little bit longer than the factory spring, but it's a little stiffer for sure as well. The stock springs are actually surprisingly stiff, but this one's real stiff. So that'll give us some more weight carrying capacity for putting 2 blokes in this thing off-road. And that's the strut. Pretty big shaft, McPherson strut. Also, neither one of these seem like they're gas charged. You can push the strut in and it stays in, which makes it kind of a pain in the ass to assemble. And we're also leaving off this little plastic thing. One other difference is that the new spring's a smaller diameter coil. Not the coil, like the overall diameter is smaller. So we're having to leave off these guys because the new springs don't sit deep enough on them and they're just gonna crack. I don't think it's a big deal. So yeah, one side's already together. We're just doing this other side, mounting some tires, and then we'll go test her out and see how much lift we got. But that's all done. Just gotta finish up the passenger side. Worst part of this job so far was rebuilding that CV axle, putting new boots on it. Everything else is pretty straightforward. And we took off those brakes and that axle nut for no reason because, yeah. Charlie is doing his favorite thing, little death trap spring compressors. This is ATV size spring compressor because it's an ATV size spring, but it's definitely maxed out in this use case. He's got his eye protection on and his foot protection, as you can see.
As per usual.
Yeah. Yeah, so you just compress the spring, however you want to do it. Put your strut in the vise. Pull this out because it keeps falling down. It doesn't feel blown though, which is great. You see it kind of slowly suck itself back down. Like, you got to keep an eye on that. And it makes it really fun to mount. All right, so because the passenger CV axle is much shorter than the driver's one, there's actually a pretty severe angle on it with this 2-inch lift at full down travel. I think it's designed well to not break it, but you really couldn't go much more, you'd have issues. I mean, the bottom of the strut's very close to hitting the axle in the CV boot, and those angles are pretty maxed out. Yeah. Once we get it, get the camber set right and stuff, that's actually gonna put a little bit more angle onto the outer joint, well, like inner joint too, but most of the outer joint. But yeah, it's gonna be kind of maxed out. But I bought this little lift kit. I don't remember who makes it. It was like 200 bucks shipped, and I'm pretty happy with it. For that price, I wasn't even gonna try to get out the welder and make something myself. Pretty cool. All right, so the front's done. We got about 3 inches of lift right now, sitting static. Looks pretty cool. A lot more clearance under the engine, which is what we were going for because it was getting bellied out there. So that won't drag as much. It'll protect it from getting so full of mud and hitting stumps. And realistically, once we have two people in it, it's more almost like a 4-inch lift because we've reduced the sag by a heavier spring rate. So sitting right now, it's a little over 3 inches. Once you put 2 people in it, the difference between stock and 2 people in it now is gonna be about 4 inches. So that's a huge improvement in front ground clearance, center ground clearance. Now we're doing the back lift, and the back lift is just some really simple, longer shackles. And I think that's a good way to do it because in the rear, you have the issue of the rear drive shaft is super short. So you don't want to make the drive shaft angle too much in the rear because it's a short drive shaft. So going with these longer shackles, which you can see, the shackles are about 3.5 inches longer. But 3.5 inches here translates to about 2 inches in the center, right? Because the motion ratio, this is in the center. So if that goes down, 4 inches, that'll go down 2 inches in the midpoint kind of thing. But we're gonna throw those on there. This also does kind of clock the diff up a little bit, which will help that drive shaft angle some. And we're gonna leave the stock shocks on the rear for now. Eventually I'm gonna try to find some little better rear shocks that are a little bit longer, but I don't want to go too much longer again to protect that rear drive shaft. And in the front, no issues with the brake lines or anything like that. They're definitely kind of stretched, but they're not tight at full down travel. You can still steer fully, checked all that out. So I think it's a pretty good little lift kit. And we just kind of eyeballed the alignment for now. It's got a little bit of camber, but it's pretty close. Should be drivable, and of course we're going to get it aligned on an alignment rack. So here's your factory shackles. They have these nice flanges, and you kind of see they actually bottom out and then the bushings, you can see what the bushings ride. The ones that come in the lift kit aren't quite as nice in Toyota. They're just very basic, big flat shackles with 2 big bolts going through them, which is fine. You might have a little bit more side-to-side wiggle, but something small and light like this, it won't really matter. But also, you're actually compressing the bushings a little bit. There's not a sleeve in there for them to bottom out on. I don't think it's going to be a big deal. I think it'll work just fine. Might have some extra squeaking, so might have to spray some lubricant on the bushings from time to time, but otherwise, good to go. And you can see it gave a pretty good amount of lift there. I'm not going to have a whole lot of down travel with these stock shocks because they're pretty extended. Just where it sits now, we're obviously going to play with that and see how much down travel we have. But the front doesn't have much down travel either without me sitting in it. So unloaded, this thing is going to be pretty stiff, bouncy ride. Once you have 2 people in it and some weight in the bed, it'll ride nice, I'm sure. All right, so the front and rear lift kit is done for now. Eventually I want to add a little bit longer rear shocks, but it does have a little bit of sag right now, so I think it's going to ride just fine. And we did increase the carrying capacity by doing this. Whether you like it or not, and whether that's safe or not is a different discussion, but the stiffer spring rate up front, and because the rear axle is farther from the bump stop in the rear, we can actually put more weight before we hit the bump stop, overloading the suspension. Force equals distance times spring rate. So spring rate's the same, but the distance is higher. So basically, in my opinion, I can carry more weight. So when I put the Can-Am in the bed, it won't be sitting on the bump stops, which is great. It'll ride a little better heading to the trails. Take a little test drive now. Overall, it got just about 2 inches in the rear and just about 3 inches in the front. But again, once I load down the front with 2 people, it's going to be a really big difference off-road because it was sagging out and hitting the bump stops a lot in the front with 2 people on it. So now it's going to be a lot more cushy. And by hitting the bump stops in the front, I mean it was bottoming out the struts because there is no bump stop up front. It's a McPherson strut, and there really isn't a big piece of rubber in here. So when you bottom out the front of this thing, you're bottoming out the strut, and your only cushion is a little piece of rubber right here. That's really your front bump stop. Really would like there to be a nice piece of rubber there. I don't know if there ever was one. Whatever, it is what it is. But let's go drive it around and see how it handles. We're lazy, and we mounted the front tires. We haven't done the rear tires yet, so the rear tires are smaller. Still need to swap them. Also testing out the 2-wheel drive low mod. So right now the dash says we're in 4-wheel drive, but we know we're in 2-wheel drive because we can steer on pavement.
Here we go.
Man, the gears are low. All right, first bump. Ooh, a little stiff.
A little stiff.
A little stiff. But we are sitting high. This thing is going to flip over. Already in 3rd gear at 15 kilometers per hour. Oh, power. Man, you notice having a second person in here. It's noticeably slower with 2 people. Oh yeah. So we still have stock gearing right now because the OG small rear tires are being driven right now.
Don't flip.
Don't flip, he says. Where's the fun in that?
You got all kinds of loose bolt sounds and
I don't know what the
sitting
noise
like
is
an
about.
extra foot higher, you know.
No, like 3 inches higher.
It feels significant.
Turning feels weird making a sharp turn with the way that's aligned right now. Yeah, I'll have to play with the toe a little bit. The toe is really far off. Charlie's gonna rock the truck and you see how stiff the suspension is. Harder? It's not even compressing the suspension at all. Harder? It's not compressing it. That's just the tires wobbling. But yeah, it's pretty high now. It doesn't look that high, but man, when you go to get in the truck, it's a really big difference where the seat height is compared to where it was before. Got a lot of space here. Plenty of clearance for the 255s, by the way. Look at the front ground clearance. Oh yeah, look at that. Big time ground clearance. It's actually pretty decent. Yeah, so we really improved the breakover angle and the ground clearance in the front. The back is going to get a little improvement from the bigger tires, but the thing that's really going to help it drag the back axle is going to be those tire chains. All right, little update on the lift kit. The springs are definitely too stiff in the front. It's very bouncy. And also, at full down travel, the bottom of the strut is rubbing the axle, and you can see where it's kind of made a groove on it. So I'm gonna have to grind the bottom of the strut a little bit. That probably wouldn't be as noticeable if I didn't have the heavy duty springs. That does show that this lift kit gives you a bit too much down travel. So I'm gonna go ahead and grind the bottom of the strut a little bit. And I'm gonna cut off one rung of the spring to remove some preload. It's really probably still gonna be too stiff, but that's gonna be the best we can do for now. Eventually I'd like to get some new front struts with slightly softer springs. All right, so in an attempt to make the ride a little less harsh, I cut off half of a rung right there, and that does make it sit a little goofy, but this perch has a real deep spot in it, and once it gets compressed in there, I think it'll be okay. It might have some slight bow in it, but it's a big shaft, so it should be fine. You gotta do what you gotta do, I guess. But yeah, this spring is just too stiff, and with the amount of preload it had, I was constantly topping out, and just driving around on pavement, it was really annoying. It was constantly cock, 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 cock. So I got rid of that. Also looking at the strut mount, you can see that's your bump stop right there, that big rubber piece inside there. So it does have some kind of a bump stop, I suppose. It's a big, rubber mount. Once you bottom it out, that's what you're hitting up against, is that big piece in there. But yeah, I'm gonna grease this up real good because I didn't really grease that yesterday. And it's squeaking when you turn, because that has to slide on there when you steer, right? Because it's McPherson strut, so the whole thing twists. So it might be one of the only McPherson strut vehicles I've ever owned. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. My Polaris Ace, that might be the only other thing though. I really don't usually go for McPherson strut type stuff, but in cheap little trucks like this, it's obviously fine. But it does have some funky geometry once you start trying to align it. And the reason that this right here was hitting my axle, it's because it originally was fine, but once I went in and I adjusted the camber, I had to lean the strut in, which made this start to contact the axle. All right, so I just noticed something. This bolt is farther offset than the other two. The way they made this little spacer, this is the bottom part of the spacer. Here's the top part of the spacer. So you have three things you can play with here. You can put this clocked in three different positions, and you can clock this in three different positions. You obviously want it to be able to slide as close to the body as possible. You can see where I was actually touching right there, because you need to lean the top of the strut into the vehicle a lot to get your camber back. But there's some things you can play with here if you're not getting the right camber. You could also adjust your caster a little bit with this too, right? But the main thing you're trying to do is get your camber back, because when you lift this thing, the camber gets all out of whack because of McPherson strut. So yeah, just notice that. I'm not sure if all these lift kits are like that, but there's definitely something you can play with. All right, let me show you what I did here. So I used this being offset. I pointed to that, these bolts up here, right? One of these has a bigger offset than the other. And I used it to kind of shift the top of the strut back. Laying it back gives you a little more caster, which will help it track a little truer and self-center the steering. So that bolt is the one that's farther back, which kind of pulled this back this way a little bit. So I think that'll help with my caster a little bit. And then for the camber, that's all adjusted in here with this top bolt, very similar to where I had it before. I marked it. And with my grinding, you can see that there is now a little bit of clearance, very little, between the axle shaft and the bottom of the strut. It's not touching anymore. Very close though. But that's with full down travel, right? So once I put the weight of the truck on it, it'll be fine. And if it does touch, it'll just be barely kissing it now. We'll be actually rubbing on the axle. So this side's good. I've got to do the other side. The other side doesn't have the axle rubbing issue because the other axle is much longer, so there's less angle on it because the differential is close to the passenger side. On the other side, I just got to trim the spring and duplicate where I have this thing right now, because we didn't even notice that before, that one of those was offset. So let's see where it ended up on this side, because we just kind of guessed. Yeah, right now it's over here, which is actually hurting the amount of camber I have. So I gotta obviously get this aligned, but I'm gonna end up with probably better camber than I had before, because before the top of the wheel was still kind of hanging out a little bit. All right, right, here's some I struck from the driver's side. If you look at it, you can see that all three of the bolts are evenly spaced on this one. So there's something funky going on with my lift kit, whatever. It's cheap. This hole is pretty far off center though, so I'm actually gonna use this little arrow I drew there to help get that caster, lean it back. I'm just gonna use this arrow. So I point this arrow forward, that leans the strut back a little bit. Best I can do, but yeah, this lift kit's a little wonky. Also, the material looks a little different. This ring is thinner on one of my spacers than the other one. Does it matter? Probably not. It's a little baby truck, but a little goofy, guys. All right, so I think that worked well. It got about another 1/2 inch of sag, which is a big deal because this thing only has a little bit of travel. Let me show you how I get my alignment just close enough so I can get it to the alignment shop. I put a level on the wheel right here, and you can see the bubble needs to come out a little bit to be up and down, but that's pretty close to level as far as camber goes. So that'll be drivable. Check that on both sides. Make sure it's matching. That's the most important thing. Yeah, so we got about the same amount of camber on both sides. It's the opposite of racing camber, but it is what it is because McPherson strut, yada, yada, yada. And then to check the toe, I simply throw up an old molding like this, lay it against the tire, and see where it lines up back there. You can see that it's about 0 toe. And then do the same thing on this side. Lay that against the tire. And it's pretty similar. So I think it's close enough. I did drive it around like this a lot yesterday, like 70 miles on pavement at 60 miles an hour. And it drives fine. So eyeballing it is good enough to get it close like that. Obviously, for optimal handling and tire wear, I'm going to get it aligned properly. The front of the truck is 1/2 inch lower now, which actually makes it more level. And yeah, pretty happy with it. What else is he going to tell you? Oh yeah, with my oversized tires, my 155s, I can hit 66 miles an hour now. And that's not all the time. That's like perfectly level ground. If there's someone drafting, maybe. But before, I was kind of RPM limited at 62. So the big tires helped the top speed in some circumstances. Sometimes I can only get like 63 if the road's not totally flat or whatever. All right, so there's the tire change. I know you're probably thinking, tire change are stupid, you live in Florida, but look at these things. That adds an inch of tread to the tire with these little V-bars, and that's gonna be extremely high traction. I'm probably gonna run them in the rear because the rear has no weight on it, so it needs extra grip. I'm just trying it on the front because this is my new tire. That's the correct size for these chains. They fit pretty good. I have another rung tighter I could go if I need to, which I think they will probably get to there after I ride them around some. But yeah, it's a pretty simple little tensioner mechanism. You just kind of fold it through and hook it like that. And then you got to put a zip tie to hold this stuff from slopping around, but looks pretty mean. Those V-bars are gonna eat.